so he could lay out by the food the way that he wanted her to be. And that hurted him.
For 10 years, she moved through the most famous private home in America without making a single headline. She cooked his meals at midnight, folded his clothes before dawn, and stood in the hallway when the world fell apart around her. Nancy Rooks was never supposed to be part of the Elvis Presley story. She was hired through an agency as a temporary placement, a one-time favor while another worker recovered from illness. But Vernon Presley saw something in her the moment she walked through those Graceland doors, a steadiness, a quiet competence, a rare ability to be present without demanding anything in return. So he asked her to stay, and she did. For a decade, Nancy lived inside a world that millions of fans could only dream about, not the rhinestone and spotlight version, but the real one, the barefoot in bathrobes version, where Elvis Presley padded down the stairs at 3 in the morning asking if there was any peach cobbler left. She saw the man behind the myth every single day. She witnessed the private rituals, the unguarded moments, the version of Elvis that existed only when the cameras were off and the crowds had gone home. And for nearly half a century after his death, she said almost nothing about what she truly witnessed. She gave warmth when people asked. She gave dignity when others gave gossip. She wrote books that offered glimpses but never exposed the whole picture. She was known, among everyone who had ever crossed paths with Graceland, as the one who could be trusted because she never once broke that trust. Until the end of her own life, when she finally opened a door she had kept sealed for 45 years, and what came through it was something no documentary, no biography, and no tell-all book had ever managed to capture. What she said doesn't just add a footnote to Elvis Presley's story. It reframes the entire final chapter of the man behind the legend, and it raises questions that history, for all its certainty, has never been able to fully answer. To understand why Nancy's words carry the weight they do, you first have to understand what she actually was inside that house, because her role went far beyond any job description. Yes, she cleaned. Yes, she cooked. She mastered his favorites with the kind of care that only comes from genuinely wanting to get it right. The peanut butter and banana sandwiches, the fried pickles, the meatloaf and cornbread, all of it prepared on Elvis's schedule, which meant her shift often started at 5 in the evening and stretched deep past midnight into the quiet hours of the morning. But what she really provided was something far more rare inside Graceland, and that was steadiness. That house was a constant swirl of bodyguards, celebrities, hangers-on, childhood friends, girlfriends, yes-men, and managers, all orbiting Elvis, all wanting something from him, all performing some version of themselves to keep his attention or protect their position within his world. Nancy wasn't performing anything. She was just there, doing her job, and in doing so, she became one of the few people Elvis never had to manage. He knew what she wanted, which was nothing beyond the ordinary, and that made her presence a quiet kind of relief in a life that was almost never quiet. There were nights when the house emptied out and the noise fell away, and Elvis would wander into the kitchen not because he was hungry, but because he needed somewhere to land. Nancy described moments where he'd ask her and his grandmother Minnie May to sing hymns together in the kitchen, not perform, not entertain, just sing quietly in the way people do when they need to feel something familiar and safe. No audience, no cameras, no expectation. Just a man who happened to be the most famous entertainer on the planet reaching for something that felt like home. She saw him tired in ways the public never did. She saw him generous in ways that never made the papers. She saw who came through that house and understood instinctively, after years of careful watching, which people genuinely cared about Elvis and which ones were simply extending their own lives by standing close to his light. She never said much about any of it publicly. She gave dignity and warmth in her books and rare interviews, but she held back the heavier parts, the observations that didn't have easy explanations, the moments she wasn't sure the world was ready to receive with the nuance they deserved. The summer of 1977 felt different inside Graceland, and the people who lived and worked there sensed it even if they couldn't name exactly what had shifted. Elvis was heavier than he had been in previous years. His sleep was more erratic than usual, which was already significant given that his schedule had always been famously upside down. He moved through the house with more deliberate effort. There were still flashes of the old energy, moments where he'd light up during a late-night racquetball game or joke easily with the staff in ways that felt completely like himself. But underneath those moments, something had changed. He was quieter in the spaces between, more withdrawn in ways that went beyond introversion. Nancy noticed it the way only someone who had watched him across a full decade of daily life could notice such things, not in dramatic scenes, but in the accumulation of small details. The way his appetite became unpredictable, some nights asking for full meals, other nights only wanting juice or water. The way the upstairs bathroom had quietly become a sanctuary, a place he retreated to for longer and longer stretches, out of reach and unreachable. What most people don't remember, and what the simplified version of this story consistently leaves out, is that Elvis was not preparing to disappear that summer. He had concert dates on the calendar. He was getting ready to go back on the road. A man making plans is not a man giving up, and that tension between someone clearly struggling and someone still actively moving forward is exactly the kind of complexity that Nancy Rooks understood better than almost anyone alive. On August 15th, the day before he died, Elvis played racquetball at the court on the Graceland property. He was moving, sweating, laughing with the people around him. Nobody standing at that court that afternoon had any sense they were watching a man in his final hours. That ordinariness, that complete absence of any dramatic farewell signal, is what made what followed so devastating and so disorienting to everyone who loved him and worked alongside him. In the early hours of August 16, 1977, Nancy Rooks had the last exchange she would ever have with Elvis Presley, and for decades she described the surface of it without fully revealing what it had come to mean to her over the years that followed. He had come in from the racquetball court, tired from the game but alert, present in the way she recognized as genuinely him rather than the medicated fog that sometimes settled over his eyes. She offered breakfast the way she always did, because that was her instinct and her role, a consistent act of care that had defined their relationship for 10 years. He shook his head, said he wasn't hungry, that he just wanted sleep, but he asked for water. She called over to Pauline, another staff member who was nearby, to bring it out in one of the plastic grip jugs they kept stocked in the kitchen. What happened next never left either woman. Elvis took that jug and drank from it with a kind of urgency neither of them had seen before. Fast, deep, like a man making up for something. Pauline looked at Nancy afterward and said she had never once seen him drink water like that in all her time working at Graceland. Nancy told her he was probably just overheated from the game, working through a real thirst after the physical exertion. It made complete sense in the moment, but she never stopped thinking about it in the decades that followed, because that was the last thing she ever gave him. Water in a plastic jug, handed over in a quiet kitchen in the middle of a morning that looked entirely ordinary from the outside. He thanked her, said goodnight the way he always did, and went upstairs. A few hours later, Ginger Alden found him unresponsive on the bathroom floor, and the house that had always hummed with motion and noise and life went completely and irrevocably silent. For decades after that morning, Nancy carried things she chose not to say out loud, and that choice was never made out of indifference. She was careful in her interviews, careful in her books, always walking a deliberate line between honoring the man she had known and protecting something she felt was too fragile to hand over to a world that might not receive it with the seriousness it deserved. She had no scores to settle, no grudges to air, no financial motivation to sensationalize. And so she didn't. But in her final years, something began to change in her. She started speaking with more weight, more urgency, not because she was seeking a platform, but because she was watching time close in and recognizing that no one else who had truly lived inside that house was going to say what she felt needed to be said. The pills, she began to acknowledge more openly in private conversations, were part of the picture, but not in the way the official narrative had always framed them. She described the medical presence around Elvis not as genuine health care, but as a kind of management, a system designed to keep him functional and on schedule rather than to make him truly well. She never once suggested he was trying to destroy himself. She insisted on the precise opposite. She told people close to her that Elvis had been asking different questions in those final weeks, reading books on spirituality, on personal transformation, on what it meant to change direction in the middle of a life. He had spoken to her quietly and privately about wanting to step away from the machinery of his own fame, not from music, not from himself, but from the relentless weight of being Elvis Presley around the clock with no room to breathe. And then in a small, recorded conversation just months before her own death. She finally said the words she had been holding for nearly half a century. He was not ready to die, not the way people think. He was tired, yes, worn down by years of carrying more than any one person should have to carry, but there was something in his eyes that last morning that looked like a man trying to find his footing again, not a man who had already let go. She described a moment from just days before his death when he asked her quietly, almost casually, whether she believed people could genuinely start over. She told him yes, if they really wanted to. And he said, almost to himself, maybe I will then. Maybe one day I'll just wake up and leave all of this behind and go somewhere quiet and just be a man again. She said he smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that sits right on the edge between joking and meaning it completely. She had never been able to stop wondering, across all the years that followed, which side of that edge he was actually standing on. The response to Nancy's final testimony didn't arrive with the noise of breaking news or the urgency of a viral moment. It traveled the way truth tends to travel when it has been held back for a long time, slowly, carefully, through the people who were paying close enough attention to recognize what they were hearing. It began moving through Elvis fan communities, passed between longtime collectors and devoted followers who understood immediately that this was something entirely different from the recycled speculation that circulated constantly around Presley's legacy. This was Nancy Rooks, the woman who had spent a decade inside that house and decades more keeping its secrets. The woman who had never embellished, never sought a spotlight, never given anyone a reason to question her integrity. And she was saying, in the clearest terms she had ever used, that the story the world had accepted for 45 years was missing something essential. Not factually wrong in its broad strokes, but incomplete in the way that matters most, incomplete in its understanding of the man. Some fans who encountered her words described something close to grief releasing, a long-held tension finally allowed to unwind. They said her testimony gave them permission to remember Elvis differently, not as someone who had surrendered to the worst version of his circumstances, but as someone who was actively, quietly, privately trying to find a way back to himself. Others were more measured in their reaction, questioning the timing, wondering what had taken so long. But even those voices acknowledged the weight of what Nancy's decades of silence had actually represented. She had nothing left to gain by speaking. No book deal to close, no documentary fee to collect, no reputation left to build. She spoke in her final months because she believed she owed it to the truth, and because she had come to feel that Elvis deserved a more complete accounting than history had given him. Among people who had worked alongside her at Graceland over the years, the reaction was nearly unanimous. She never said a careless word in her life, one former colleague noted. So if Nancy said Elvis wasn't ready to go, then that's what she saw, and that means something real. What Nancy Rooks left behind when she died is not a conspiracy and not a rewritten history. It is something quieter and in many ways more enduring than either of those things. It is one woman's final insistence, delivered at the end of her own life with nothing left to protect and nothing left to fear, that the man she had known across 10 years of midnight meals and quiet mornings and ordinary human moments was more than the tragedy that ended his story. Graceland still stands today. The tours run on schedule. Visitors move through rooms frozen in time, past the jungle room and the trophy hall and the kitchen where meals were prepared for a man who lived entirely on his own terms. But the real Graceland, the living and breathing version that Nancy Rooks inhabited for a decade and then returned to night after night long after Elvis was gone, exists now only in the memories of people who were actually there. And most of those people have since passed. What remains is what she chose to leave behind. Not a scandal, not a revelation designed to shock, but the quiet and steady image of a man standing on the kitchen steps in the early hours of an August morning, turning down food, asking only for water, drinking it with the kind of urgency that suggests someone who still has somewhere to be. A man who days before that morning had asked the woman who cooked his meals and knew his moods and understood the difference between when he wanted company and when he needed silence, whether she believed a person could truly start over. She told him yes. He said, maybe I will. And she spent the rest of her life believing that he meant it, carrying that belief through 45 years of silence, through the museum and the mythology and the endless retelling of a story that always seemed to stop just short of the full truth. Because the full truth, as Nancy understood it, was not that Elvis Presley was a broken man who ran out of time. The full truth was that he was a complicated and deeply human man who was still reaching for something better right up until the moment he couldn't reach anymore. And the woman who handed him that last glass of water, who watched him drink it down fast and purposeful and alive, wanted the world to finally know that. Not for her sake, for his.